During the Mexican-American War of 1846, some of the bloodiest and most ferocious engagements the US Army fought were not against Mexican troops, but a small number of dedicated Irish Catholics, newly arrived immigrants who had deserted from the US Army and crossed over to fight and die for the Mexican cause. Known as the Saint Patricks Battalion, this small but elite artillery unit of defectors would time and time again unleash carnage and inflict heavy losses on the invading Americans, men who had once been on the same side but were now bitter adversaries. But just what drove so many Irishmen to switch sides and wage war against their former adopted homeland? The Irish have a long tradition of fighting the wars of other nations. Fleeing persecution, famine, and poverty, over the centuries countless sons of Ireland have looked abroad for brighter horizons. However, all too often they instead found only war. One of the largest waves of human migration in history would occur during the 19th century, when it's estimated that over 6 million Irish emigrated to the United States, an unstoppable outflow of human souls that reached its peak during the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852, when as many as 2 million people made the journey across the Atlantic, a figure which represented a quarter of the population of Ireland at the time. Widespread crop failure caused by a potato blight, coupled with British landowners refusing to halt the export of Irish-produced food, resulted in a famine that killed as many as 1 million people through starvation and disease. Desperate to escape the ravages of what became known as the Great Hunger, the vast majority of these Irish exiles made their way to the United States, where they hoped that a better future would await them. However, for many of these new arrivals, only more suffering and exploitation lay ahead. This arrival of fresh waves of fighting-age men provided the US Army with fertile recruitment opportunities, and tens of thousands would enlist in cities like New York and Boston, hoping for steady pay and a path to US citizenship. In fact, this recruitment was so prolific that it's estimated that as much as half of the entire US military in the mid-19th century was foreign-born, with a quarter of the army being Irish-born. Yet, whatever illusions these foreign recruits may have had about their new life in the Americas would quickly be shattered, for the New World was every bit as violent and unjust as the Old World they had left behind. The United States' short history had already been one of war, struggle, and conquest, and the thousands of Irishmen who were now filling the army's depleted ranks would soon find themselves shipped off to war. What would become a 2-year-long war with Mexico was sparked by the United States' controversial annexation of Texas in 1845. Texas had been an independent republic following its separation from Mexico 9 years earlier. However, Mexico had never relinquished its claims over the territory, and had always insisted that any move by the United States to absorb the breakaway republic would mean war. Despite such threats, the United States did not fear war. In fact, many within the administration actively wished for it, confident that they could beat their weaker rival and seize vast swathes of territory in the process, fulfilling their long-held belief in the concept of manifest destiny, the idea that it was the justified right, and indeed the inevitable duty of the United States, to take control of the rest of the Americas. With the majority of Texans in favor of joining the United States, Texas became the 28th state on December 29, 1845, and following a series of skirmishes between Mexican and US forces along the border, just 4 months later the expansionist President Polk eventually persuaded Congress to issue a formal declaration of war. The US quickly seized the initiative, invading Mexico from the north with a standing army that had been bolstered with 50,000 new recruits, many of whom were born outside of the country and were not yet citizens. These new foreign-born recruits were not marching to war with blind patriotism, and many soon began to question whether they were on the right side in a war that was increasingly viewed as an unjustified land grab against a weaker neighbor. Such concerns would be exasperated by the poor treatment they received at the hands of their native-born officers. At that time, attitudes in the US towards immigrants, and in particular Irish immigrants, were generally negative, with many viewing the new arrivals with suspicion and outright hostility. This low opinion of the Irish was even more prevalent in the US Army, and native officers and soldiers alike viewed the immigrant Irish recruits as inferior and unworthy, giving them the worst and dirtiest jobs, barring any chance of promotion, and handing out harsh and unjust punishments for even the most minor infractions of the rules. Such mistreatment at the hands of men who were supposed to be brothers in arms fueled the growing resentment of Irish-born troops, and many began to regret enlisting in an army which seemed to treat them as little more than expendable, unwanted slaves. Yet perhaps the biggest source of ill feeling was the religious discrimination they suffered. Irish recruits were virtually all Catholic, but served under a US officer class that was almost entirely Protestant. Such a deep religious divide would prove to be a recipe for disaster. The Protestant officers viewed their new Catholic troops as entirely untrustworthy, their loyalty to a foreign pope ridiculed and deemed incompatible with the ideal of a true American patriot. Catholic soldiers were outright barred from attending Catholic masses, and some were even forced to attend Protestant services, while several Mexican Catholic churches would be defaced as the war progressed. Such brazen affronts to their deeply held faith, coupled with ongoing resentment at general mistreatment, resulted in many of these Irish-born recruits deciding to abandon their posts and defect over to the Mexican side. The short swim south across the Rio Grande, landing them in friendlier territory with their fellow Catholic Mexicans. Increasingly large numbers of Irish-American soldiers began to realize that they had far more in common with Mexicans than Americans. The two nations shared Catholic religion, coupled with their ongoing struggle against a more powerful Protestant neighbor, making them natural allies. Mexican generals soon learned of the dissatisfaction spreading amongst the ranks of Irish and other foreign-born Catholic recruits fighting for the invading US Army, and quickly moved to take advantage of this golden opportunity, actively fanning the flames of discontent as they did everything within their power to stoke divisions in the multi-ethnic enemy army. Propaganda leaflets were printed and covertly distributed behind enemy lines, the flyers appealing to their shared Catholicism, while also promising safe passage throughout Mexico for deserters, including higher wages, lucrative land grants starting at 320 acres, and even citizenship and potential military commissions, a possibility that was all but denied to the Irish Catholics within the American Army. For men born into grinding poverty, who had only recently escaped one of the worst famines in history, these generous economic incentives, coupled with the promise of equal treatment and freedom of religion, were highly enticing, and with many already sympathetic to Mexico's plight, the thought of fighting for a Protestant power against a weaker Catholic neighbor became simply unbearable. During the course of the war, more than 5,000 US soldiers would desert from a force of 40,000, many of them crossing over to Mexican territory where they were welcomed as heroes, a number of these not only willingly abandoning their posts, but also enlisting with the Mexican army to fight against the invading Americans. John Riley was one such defector, a dissatisfied Irish-born Catholic serving with the American Army, who made the decision to cross over into Mexican territory in April 1846. Riley's knowledge of and experience with artillery so impressed the Mexican generals that he was awarded an officer's commission and given permission to gather together other foreigners who had deserted into a cohesive fighting force. Riley would go on to form and lead what became known as the Saint Patricks Battalion, a collection of some 175 mostly European-born immigrants, the great majority of whom were Irishmen who had only recently arrived at northeastern US ports. The small artillery unit rapidly grew in size as more and more deserters arrived, and it's thought that at its peak some 700 foreign-born defectors fought under its specially created green silk banner, the harp and Mexican coat of arms embroidered upon it, symbolizing this new unofficial Irish and Mexican alliance. Deployed as an artillery unit for much of the war, the Saint Patricks Battalion developed a reputation for courage and skill during some of the conflict's most ferocious battles, winning respect and admiration from the Mexicans, while at the same time being cursed by their former American comrades as villainous, traitorous dogs who deserved to be relentlessly hunted down and put to justice. The Saint Patricks Battalion first saw action at the Battle of Monterey on the 21st of September 1846, the Irishmen taking up position inside a fort blocking the entrance to the city, from where they were able to target the advancing American soldiers with unrelenting barrages of devastatingly accurate artillery fire, the stubborn defense repulsing several waves of enemy attacks until Mexican commanders decided to abandon the city and fall back. The battalion would once again prove their tenacity and bravery at the Battle of Buena Vista 5 months later, when the Mexican general Santa Anna was attempting to evict a large force of entrenched American troops who were occupying areas of northern Mexico. Although this attempt at liberation would ultimately fail, the Irishmen distinguished themselves in combat, supporting the advance of the Mexican infantry as they poured lethal artillery fire into the tightly packed enemy ranks, winning special praise for a heroic but insane bayonet charge against a US artillery position that resulted in the capture of 2 6-pound cannons. Despite engaging in a costly artillery duel, which would result in roughly 1/3 of their number killed or injured, the Irishmen stood their ground and refused to abandon their position, resulting in several of their number winning the Mexican War Cross and promotions for their gallantry in the face of the enemy. Due to the massive losses they had suffered, the heavily depleted Saint Patricks Battalion was reorganized into an infantry unit and renamed as the Foreign Legion of Patrick to better represent its now more international makeup, since so many of the original founding Irishmen had been killed in combat. Yet despite this effort to preserve and continue the battle-scarred battalion's legacy, the foreign defectors would finally meet their match at the Battle of Churubusco on August 20th, 1847, when on the outskirts of Mexico City, they would make their last stand of the war. Holed up in a fortified convent, the remaining men of the Irish battalion fought tooth and nail to fend off the attacking Americans, the battle descending into a brutal close-quarters fight to the death as the Irish and their allies desperately tried to throw back the attacking Americans, while the US Army relentlessly pushed forward, the determined American troops keen to exact revenge upon men whom they saw as dishonorable traitors for all of the carnage they had inflicted during the war. With ammunition running low, the fate of the Mexicans and Irishmen was sealed when a stray artillery spark caused their remaining ammunition to explode, the resulting inferno engulfing several of the defenders and leaving those still alive with no means with which to continue the fight. Hopelessly outnumbered, many of the demoralized Mexican defenders attempted to surrender, raising a white flag to signal their capitulation, only for the Irishmen to immediately tear it down as they implored the defenders to fight on with their bare hands if necessary, no doubt realizing that surrender would result in their execution, the Americans unlikely to show any mercy to the hated Irish defectors. One American private would later report that he witnessed men of the Saint Patricks Battalion gun down and kill 2 Mexican soldiers who had attempted to raise another white flag. Such was their desire to resist until the end. Despite this tenacity and stubbornness, the Mexican position had become untenable, and the defenders were soon completely overrun. For the Saint Patricks Battalion, the battle was both their crowning achievement and an unmitigated disaster, their refusal to surrender or retreat, leaving 35 of their number laying dead around the convent, with a further 85 taken prisoner, representing a loss of over 60% of their total strength, a death blow from which the battalion could never recover. For the men who had been captured, no lenience or mercy would be shown. The battalion's founder, John Riley, along with the other surviving prisoners, were tried for desertion at 2 mass courts-martial. At both trials, the men were denied legal representation, and no transcripts of the proceedings were made. Some of the defendants claimed that they had deserted while drunk, or were forced to join the Mexican army, a futile attempt to save their neck from the hangman's noose. However, the majority simply offered no defense, no doubt resigned to the fate that inevitably awaited them. 48 of the accused were found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging, while 2 others would face a firing squad at what became the largest mass execution in US history. This sentence was considered highly unusual, since hanging deserters was a violation of the Articles of War, which clearly stated that those who had defected during wartime should be punished with death by firing squad. Hanging was supposed to be reserved for spies operating without a uniform, or for those who had committed atrocities against civilians. The men of the Saint Patricks Battalion had been charged with neither of these crimes. In fact, of the estimated 9,000 US soldiers who deserted during the Mexican-American War, only the men of the Saint Patricks Battalion would be punished by hanging, a statistic which shows just how hated the Irish deserters had become. John Riley and a small number of the other deserters managed to escape death, only because they deserted before the war was declared. This relatively lucky handful of men, given 50 lashes, branded with the letter D for deserter, and made to wear iron yokes around their necks for the rest of the war. However, like those who had been hanged, this punishment also violated the Articles of War, which clearly stated that soldiers who had deserted before war was declared were supposed to be branded, flogged, or sentenced to hard labour. Unlike other deserters during the war, the men of the Saint Patricks Battalion received all 3 of these punishments. The remnants of the battalion who had escaped the clutches of US Army justice would fight on to the end, seeing action at the Battle of Mexico City, which proved to be the final battle of the war, a conflict that resulted in Mexico being forced to cede half of its territory to the US. Although the peace treaty included a clause which guaranteed the release of any surviving members of the battalion still in US custody, just 6 months later, the Saint Patricks Battalion was finally disbanded after the men were accused of being involved in an attempted military coup, the few still living ultimately making a new life for themselves in their adopted homeland. However, despite their story finally coming to an end, the legacy of this unusual group of largely Irish defectors remains potent yet controversial even in the present day. In Mexico, the men are still considered to be heroes and martyrs, idealistic warriors who fought against an unjust invasion for a cause they believed in, their name forever memorialized by countless schools, churches, and landmarks across the country. In the US, the men were seen as traitors and dishonorable criminals, the entire affair an embarrassing chapter in history that until recently was largely covered up, the army denying their existence in an effort to discourage other potential deserters, only forced to admit their denial of the matter following a 1915 congressional inquiry. Heroes and martyrs to some, traitors and villains to others, the remarkable tale of this handful of warriors fighting for a new life so far from home shows just how easily friends can become foes during times of war and upheaval. Do you think the Saint Patricks Battalion were heroes or villains? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you again on the next video.